All right. Welcome back, fellow football fanatics. This is another episode of Touchdown Talk. Previously named Sam's Spread, but after a decision was made, I thought it was more appropriate, along with most of the audience, to name it Touchdown Talk, since I don't cover the spread. And many of you, just wanted a different name. So Touchdown Talk is what it will be for at least the rest of this season. Um, on here is Zachary Priehs, who is a graduate student at Syracuse. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
In broadcast and digital journalism. Awesome. Okay, at least I remembered that now. But he
You
is
got it
joining
down.
us. Exactly. He's joining us to talk about all these different things. How will the former Pac 12 schools who are joining the Big Ten, how will they function? Him and I have three teams each that we believe can make the college football playoff that we would classify as dark horses, teams that really no one, if any, is paying attention to. And we'll also talk about if Penn State and Michigan are national title contenders, and most importantly of all, what's up with Ryan Day at Ohio State? What do we think his job situation is? And what's the state of the program, the fan base? What do they want this year? Um, all of that and more here on this episode of Touchdown Talk. Please make sure to hit the like button, to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts in the live chat. As I've said in episode 1, we're only interrupting our flow when we have a super chat, which we got one from Mr. ZZYZXX, a $7.11 super chat. And thank you for the $7.11, Mr. Zizix. That's probably how you say it. He says the Big Ten will have some surprises this year. Normal also ran Rutgers, Michigan State, and Nebraska, in his opinion, all greatly improved. What do you think about that, Zach?
He said Rutgers, Michigan State, and Nebraska. Nebraska's going to be interesting. Dylan Raiola, obviously at quarterback. That whole recruiting chase was some. We could do a whole episode on that. Raiola, it's going to be fun to watch him. Their struggle last year was largely at quarterback, so that's going to be very interesting. Michigan State, I think it might take a couple years. Give him a chance to get his guys there, and then obviously you've got the history and you've got the recruiting potential. Rutgers, yeah, I love where their program's going. I think out of those three, though, Nebraska's the best this year. What about you?
Out of all of those, I would say that Nebraska probably has the highest ceiling. I'd say Rutgers has the highest floor. But I do think that Michigan State can surprise. I actually think out of all of these teams, Michigan State probably, if they can land, let's say, Keandre Lambert Smith in the portal, like just one decent receiver, they could have the best skill position players out of all of these teams. Because I think Aiden Giles will be good. I like Nathan Carter at running back. And they brought in Velling, their star tight end from Oregon State. And Oregon State's been good at tight end. So, yeah, I think that these are schools that are all going to go bowling. All of them are going to take steps forward compared to last season. Thank you for that super chat, Mr. ZZYZXX. Very creative name. Again, as I've said before, we'll get to any questions you have that aren't super chats at the end. We'll reserve some time for that, but we'll only interrupt our flow with any super chats that you guys have, just because we're getting a large following here on College Football with Sam. We just broke 15,600 subs yesterday. And look, in regular videos, I'm going to try and answer comments regardless if they're super chats or not. That's my thing. I like interacting with the audience. But we have a lot to talk about on here. So let's get into that. You said one of your ideas, because I always have people bring their ideas on this show and then I have my own. You said you wanted to talk about, along with Ryan Day and Ohio State and what their football program expects of them this year and in the future, You want to talk about how Oregon, UCLA, USC, and Washington would do. And I think what is a better place to start off with than Oregon? What do you think of when you think of Oregon to the Big Ten?
Well, yeah. I mean, when I think of Oregon to the Big Ten, the talent is through the roof, right? They've got the talent. The question is whether the style of play will translate to the Big Ten Conference. And I'll start out with the bad news for Oregon fans. The bad news for Oregon fans is you lost twice to Washington last year, and you saw what Michigan did to Washington in the national championship game. Michigan put up 103 or 303, excuse me, on the ground for 8 a carry. So that's the bad news if you're Oregon. The good news if you're Oregon is you've got a coach in Dan Lanning who is not stubborn and will adjust. So he's going to build a team that's going to play Big Ten football, I believe. The question, I think, is how long it takes them to build that team. Is it this year? Is it next year? Is it the year after that? So how long does it take this squad and this roster to play that Big Ten brand of football that you really, I think, have to play to be successful in the Big Ten?
Do you think that they can run the football effectively and also stop the run effectively?
Oregon, stopping the run, they stopped the run really well last year. I believe they held opponents to 3.5 yards a carry, if I'm not mistaken. So I do believe they can stop the run effectively. Especially, I don't know if you've got the same level of run offenses in the Big Ten this year necessarily. Michigan, of course, loses a lot on that offensive line. Ohio State, I'm not sure if they're going to be a complete ground and pound team either. And Penn State, of course, Drew Aller, they're going to try to lean on him, hopefully to push the ball downfield a little bit. So I'm not sure there will be as much pressure on that run defense as there may have been in the past couple of years. And they're a really good run defense. So I do think so. I do think this Oregon team is going to hold their own defending the run. Now, whether they're going to be able to run the ball or not, I think that's a different question. They ran for a ridiculous yards per carry last year. It was someplace in the sixes, I believe, as a team, which is absurd. But a lot of that was due to the spread offense they played and how good of a deep ball threat Bo Nix is. So due to that, teams had to spread their defense, which let CJ Verdell in the run game be so impactful. So I'm not sure if they'll have quite the same success in the run game as they did last year.
I think when it comes to CJ Verdell, he's been he was quick, but he graduated forever ago. I think you're thinking of Irving
Irving.
Bucky Irving and Jordan James. I love Jordan James this year.
Excuse me, Irving. Yeah. Irving, not CJ Verdell. No, he's not still playing. He Bo might be a similar age as Bo Nix, but did not play with him last year.
Yeah. I think they'll be able to run really effectively. I think their run offense might be the best in the Big Ten. I think that their rushing attack, probably given what they return at O-line with a Johnny Cornelius, Josh Connerly Jr., and I think Marcus Harper II started some at guard last year, and the way they recruit, and they return their tight end, which always helps, and Jordan James had some starts, and Gabriel is a proven QB, and he can run the football as well. I think all of that combined probably gives Oregon the most explosive rushing attack and probably the one with the highest floor. And then I would go probably Penn State for highest floor. And Penn State I'd also probably give the edge to with power running. Ohio State's is probably the most boom or bust in the sense that their O-line could be bad, but their running back room's the best in the country. I think Oregon's question is, can you stop the run? Because I know you, in your opinion, they're good, and I think that their defense last year was very admirable, but they also did not play a tough schedule. Like, they played USC, who had a mediocre O-line. Washington was the best team that they played by a mile, and Washington coached circles around them twice. But they're there, and I think they can compete in the Big Ten, and even for the title. I have them reaching the national championship just as soon as this year. Do you think that, short-term and long-term, this is probably the best former Pac-12 team in the Big Ten, as a program?
I do think so. And I think so largely because of Dan Lanning. If there was a coach other than Dan Lanning at Oregon, I wouldn't be nearly as confident in their ability to adjust. because sometimes you see teams that they come to a new conference or they play. You travel to play a Big Ten team or an SEC team, and playing ACC ball or Pac-12 ball does not work in those conferences, and we've seen that over time. I believe history backs me up there. Dan Lanning, he already preaches physicality, so that's already his motto. And I can only imagine he's going to be telling this team in the offseason, hey guys, people expect you to get bullied. People expect Michigan to bully you. People expect Ohio State to bully you. And, he coaches with a bit of an attitude and a chip on his shoulder. So I think he's going to build that tough culture.
I completely agree. Before the Nick Saban retiring set off a ton of dominoes that I didn't expect. I don't think anyone expected Saban to retire. But I thought it was going to be Washington who'd be the best off before Kalen DeBoer left, but we'll get to them later, of course. But right now, I'd say Oregon. I think Oregon is the trench play, the recruiting, the head coach, the strength and conditioning and development to succeed. And they even have the potential, I think, to be at some point, I don't think now, but maybe in the future, the Big Ten's best program. Next up, what about UCLA? I feel like we're going in an opposite direction here because I have UCLA as probably the worst in the future of the Big Ten and even in the present. What do you think about that?
I'm going to have to agree with you here. I'd love to be an optimist for the UCLA program and disagree with you and tell you why they're going to be good. But Sam, I just simply don't believe that they're gonna be good in the Big Ten. They have history there. There is history there for UCLA, so maybe something is built there. But anytime you're losing your head coach, I mean, from a team that frankly was just not very good last year, and you're going to what I would certainly classify as a tougher conference, I think you'd agree with me on that. I think most people would agree with me on that. It's I don't think you have to it's just going to be tough. UCLA last season, just glancing over really surface level stats, they ran the ball for 4.5 per rush, which is solid. That's good for 44th in the country. Their run defense was actually really good. So that was the strength of this squad. They only gave up 2.7 yards per rush. That's just about flush with that elite Michigan D-line from last year, who obviously won the national championship. So the physicality on defense is there for UCLA, but at some point you do have to have good skill position players, and I'm not sure they're going to be there within the first couple of years in the Big Ten.
I buy that. And their defense, what was interesting about UCLA last year is their defense was awesome with D'Anton Lynn, who's now at USC as their DC. Like their defense was incredible. It was the biggest turnaround defense in the country. But their problem was their offense, despite being coached by Chip Kelly, was not good. It stank. It really took a nosedive toward the end of the year when they started on that losing streak, and talks about him being fired kept resurfacing. And I thought entering this season he would be fired mid-season. They would just collapse and not and be one of the worst teams in the country because they lose most of their defense. The players that aren't going to the NFL are transferring out. Like they lost a few of their defensive backs to USC, for example, their rival. And they lose Carson Steele at running back. They lose Duke Clemens, their really good center. They bring in some transfers on the O-line and wide receiver and also on defense. But they do lose that entire defensive staff. And Chip Kelly, he did not leave this team. He did not leave the Bruins in a good position. And their new head coach, Deshaun Foster, we'll have to see how he does. He got promoted from being a running backs coach. He was not put in a good position by Chip Kelly at all. So I think UCLA will have to give him time to see what he can do there.
Yeah, certainly, especially going to a new conference is really the timing all works out in the worst possible way. If you're a Bruins fan, you like you said, you're losing talent, you lose your head coach, and now guess what? Congratulations, you get to play Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State year in and year out. Not literally, because there's so many teams in the Big Ten. Everybody doesn't play everybody anymore. but you get the gist. You're
Yes.
going to really play a physical brand of football that can really beat you up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think UCLA and Oregon are polar opposites in terms of program direction. I could see UCLA becoming a poverty school, like a Rutgers or a Maryland at the beginning of joining the Big Ten, or Northwestern in Fitzgerald's final 2 seasons. I could see them spiral out of control. I mean, they were not good on average in the Pac-12 either. They Pac-10, Pac-8, yeah, but they've had some rough years in the 21st century, and now they're in a tougher, deeper conference. Let's look at their rival, and I would say their bigger brother, even though UCLA destroyed USC last year. What do you think of Lincoln Riley? I imagine a year ago you would say they're going to enter the Big Ten and they'll have to make some adjustments, but Riley's a top 10 head coach. And now, 8-5 with Caleb Williams and a defense that was worse than just about anyone predicted. What do you think of USC right now?
Man, it's really hard to buy Lincoln Riley stock, having seen that he is so far unable to turn out good defenses or competent defenses. I mean, watching USC games last year was rough, and I'm not saying this for dramatic effect. It was physically frustrating to watch USC's defense play. Watching a Big Ten game or an SEC game or even a Big 12 game, and then watching USC was so just the coaching on defense, whether that falls on Riley, whether that falls on the defensive staff, was just not there. Just no discipline from defensive players, especially tackling and rallying to the ball. So first of all, that has to be fixed, especially in the Big Ten. And teams, listen, stereotypes aren't always true. In fact, a lot of times they're not in general in life, but sometimes sports stereotypes are true. And USC has a stereotype recently. Riley teams more specifically have a stereotype of being soft. And so they're going to come into the Big Ten, and a lot of Big Ten teams are going to try to punch them in the mouth. So they better be ready for that. And I mean, this is a squad that they gave up 4.8 yards per rush defensively. That's good for 106th in the country. You know, that's just not great. And when you're coming to such a physical conference, I think it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. I can see someone buying stock in Riley only because they got a good DC in D'Anton Lynn. They hired Eric Henderson, who is the D-line coach of the Rams. They got an NFL D-line coach to be their D-line coach. They brought in North Dakota State's head coach as their linebackers coach. So they're trying everything they can do to build a good defense and a good staff. And Doug Belk, Houston's defensive coordinator, who's done a good job at developing secondary players, they brought him in as their secondary coach. So they're loaded at defensive staff. But
yeah.
For me, it's like Jim Knowles hired Ohio State, and their defense looked good in 2022 for the first 11 games, but they still missed tackles. They still allowed big plays. And against the best offenses they faced all season, Michigan and Georgia, they crumbled. And I think it's going to take USC a year at minimum for that defense to be anything that resembles a top 25 unit. And their schedule is tough too. I know we're talking about like long term, not just short term. In the short term, I think you gotta keep the expectations reasonable. And maybe people, especially USC fans, will disagree with that. But yeah, depending on who you were, games like watching USC was, like you said, rough. I hated it. When they actually lost some games, it was like watching Iowa lose a game. It was the best thing ever, because finally this team that defies all laws of what a college football team should be is smacked back down to reality. Like, I hate purely one-dimensional teams who intentionally practice cognitive dissonance and act like their way's the best, and then they're not the best. It's delusional, and USC And I'd say Riley teams, even some at Oklahoma, have been delusional teams. I mean, there's this obvious ceiling, and we'll see what USC can do. I think long term they have an awesome future as long as they keep Riley in the long run and the hires work out. What do you think about their long term future? I'm curious.
Yeah, I do think they have a long term future. I don't think it's quite as great as Oregon with Dan Lanning, but I mean, let's be honest. Bottom line is Lincoln Riley is a good coach. Now, has he struggled defensively horrendously? Yes, he has, and let's not sugarcoat that. But overall, he's a desirable hire, and a lot of schools around the country right now, at the snap of a finger, would drop their guy and say, "Give us Lincoln Riley," and there's a reason for that. He develops quarterbacks like nobody you've ever seen before. He just all his offenses are explosive year in and year out. I mean, he just developed multiple Heisman Trophy winners. The guy has a way with offenses. If that defensive staff you're talking about that you were just highlighting works out, then man, they could be elite. The question is when and if that staff will work out. But I do buy his stock long term long term in the Big Ten.
Yeah. One more question before we move on. Do you think he's overrated as a head coach?
At this point, no, because I think enough people slander him that he's not overrated. I think there's a general sentiment in college football right now that he's not a championship coach, which is fair. But because of that, I don't think he's overrated anymore. What about you? I'm curious.
That's a fair point. I was going to say yes, but now I'll say yes in terms of national writers. I think the public probably accurately rates him, if not maybe hates him too much. He's certainly a top 25, top 20 head coach, and my head coaching rankings are weird. So for the average head coaching ranking, he's probably higher than that. But yeah, I mean, I think that look, he won championships in the Big 12 at Oklahoma, so he maintained a good program. He was recruiting highly there all of his years. Smaller classes, yes, but they worked and he did well at developing them. And at USC, he's recruited well, used the portal well, and his teams look like they did at Oklahoma. The question is, can he change? And if he can change, then absolutely. He's going to be an elite head coach who can win a national championship if he makes that jump. And finally, we have the Washington Huskies. Washington loses everything, all but one of their 22 starters, and their head coach, and most of their staff. They do keep their strength and conditioning coach, who, mind you, is one of the best in the game. But that's really it.
I mean, Washington. Yeah, well, Washington, I think it's going to be rough for them this year. As a Washington fan, I think you have to look at this as a rebuilding year. Obviously, you would have loved to come into the Big Ten off that national championship appearance. Your offense was electric last year, and you try to make some noise, but that's probably not going to be the case given what they lost. Like you said, you lose all but one starter. That's absurd. And it's a testament, though, in a way, to how good that team was. They have players that are desirable both at the NFL level and for other schools. So that was an elite team. And unfortunately for them, the combination of having a lot of talent and your head coach leaving means you lost everybody. So Washington returns a whopping 19% of their offensive production. That's clearly not good. They do return 52% of their defense. So maybe that's something you can build on if you're Washington. Returning some of that defensive staff of that. Well, that's not players wise. That's defensive production and tack. We're just talking total tackles and stuff like that. And frankly, I'm not sure how that calculation is calculated, but that's according to ESPN. But the offense is just going to be tough, man. Going from that offense last year that was really personally my favorite offense to watch in the country. Love watching Michael Penix. It's hard to see a world in which they win more than 7 games.
That's understandable. Cameron Davis was injured entering last year, but he had a really good 2021 season, and they bring in Jonah Coleman at running back from Arizona. So their run game could be underrated. they bring in Will Rogers, former Mississippi State quarterback, and I think that they got Steve Belichick as their defensive coordinator. And no, that's not a joke. That's who they hired as their DC. They could they could be a top 25 team at their ceiling. Maybe with Jed Fish in there with his staff, they can pull off another Cinderella story. Although I don't think last year's story was Cinderella. They didn't blow anyone out, but they controlled games and worked teams and coaching staffs. That was an elite team last year. I look at Washington, and I don't know where to place their future. It's certainly higher than UCLA's. I can't put it above USC's, and certainly not above Oregon's right now. But I do think that Washington, USC, and Oregon have good futures, or at least above average, and UCLA's is probably the one that's in that bad category, the below average category. Which means, quite frankly, some teams in the Big Ten are going to be pushed down into the lower tier.
Yeah, and this is a little bit of a side tangent, but I know you want to stay on time here, so just really quick, I'm curious how you think, just quickly, how you think that these Pac-12 teams joining the Big Ten will affect recruiting for certain squads, because suddenly, if you're a Maryland and you just went from being the 5th dog in the conference to being the 6th, 7th, 8th dog in the conference, how does that affect kids wanting to go there? Does that knock your recruiting down a step? Maybe it doesn't, but that's something that I'd like to keep an eye on.
That is interesting. Basically, all the school, it'll make it harder for a team like Michigan State or Wisconsin, teams who have recruited well in the past. But those are very few. The Big Ten, and you know this, it's really been Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and then recruiting and Nebraska too. It'll affect Nebraska, but it's been those three, and then there's a cliff drop, and then really everyone else is kind of closer. But Nebraska, Michigan State, and Wisconsin, I think their lives will be made harder because they don't have that blue blood reputation or the powerhouse reputation that an Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan do. Oregon will jump with those three. USC, at least on a recruiting level and reputation level, will jump with those four. So, yeah, I think for some schools it'll be harder, but for your Minnesota, your Illinois, your Iowa, Matt Rule's doing well at recruiting with Nebraska, so I don't expect them to take a step back. I think they'll continue to recruit well. Maryland hasn't recruited well for the past several seasons either. I think they focus more on development. It'll change somewhat. I think it's a good question and one that I can't exactly answer, but I'd be more inclined saying things will probably stay the same, especially given that the Big Ten and the SEC are obviously the two best conferences in the country now, and it's not even close. It really is, like, instead of two groups, the Power Five and the Group of Five, it's three groups now. It's the Big Ten and SEC, the ACC and the Big 12, and then the Group of Five. Speaking of which, talking about the Big 12 and the ACC, I think that... Oh, that's my problem. You and I... Yeah, sorry, guys. You and I wrote up 3 teams that we think are dark horse college football playoff contenders. And by dark horse, we mean teams that very few people are paying attention to, or if they are, teams that I don't think most would pick to reach the college football playoff. I want to start out with one of yours, and that would be Arizona. What do you think of Arizona entering this season, and why do you think that they could reach the college football playoff? What made you pick them instead of a plethora of other teams?
Well, yeah, I mean, and to be honest, part of it has to be the conference they're going to and the teams leaving that conference. So Arizona's going to go to a Big 12 that is going to be a little bit weakened. It's not going to have Oklahoma or Texas anymore. As we all know, they're going to the SEC. So Arizona's going to have a little bit of an easier schedule this year. They're not necessarily going to play a team that you're going to chalk as, okay, that's a loss. So Arizona last season, they had a good offense. They scored 34.3 points a game, and specifically their passing offense. Let me pull up this statistic really quick to make sure I'm correct here. Yes, so yards per pass, they were the 19th best team in the country. They averaged 8.5 yards per pass. That's very efficient. Their completion percentage as a team was over 71%. That's good for fifth in the country. And they passed the 19th most often out of any team in America. So this team is explosive. They can put up points. They're going to a conference that's going to be a little bit weakened. I think the timing is really good for them. They've got a lot of momentum going for their program right now. Their defense is solid. They only gave up 7.3 yards per pass, so they're plus 1.2 in that category per pass. That's quite good. And defensively, they only give up 3.8 yards per rush, which is nothing to write home about, but that's good for 37th in the country. So I think a combination of having a explosive offense and good timing and transferring to another conference, it really makes them a dark horse for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're returning Noah Fifita still, although I just looked up Arizona's depth chart to make sure that I got the fact that they're returning to Terioa. I hope that's how you pronounce his name, McMillan, who's a really good wide receiver. And on defense and on offense, they lose some guys, but they return parts of their offensive line. They have that elite receiver. And as far as I know, Fafita is coming back. He declined to transfer with his head coach, Jed Fish, to Washington. I have no clue why he isn't listed on the Arizona Wildcats depth chart at this moment on ourlads.com, which is typically what I use, and sometimes they get it wrong, but for the most part, they're accurate. Fafita is really the intriguing piece to this whole team. And he is the reason why they were so efficient in those categories that you brought up. And they do join a Big 12 that is, as you said, it's weaker than the past Big 12, and it's weaker than the Pac-12 that Arizona left as that conference imploded. Any other thoughts on Arizona, whether it's their schedule or who do you have in front of them in the Big 12 maybe?
Well, when we're talking who's going to finish in front of them in the Big 12, I think the Big 12 is going to be a little bit of a salad this year. I could see Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State, man, they're tough to predict at times just due to how unpredictable they have been. I could see Oklahoma State finishing up there. You know, a team like Kansas. I'll talk about them in a little bit. Kansas, I think, could be up there as well. Obviously, Oklahoma and Texas hitting the back door. West Virginia is a team that we'll see. I don't think they're going to be that good. They play Penn State week 1. If they win that game, maybe it catapults them up there. But the Big 12 is a little bit of a toss-up. I do think Kansas will be good and Oklahoma State. And besides those two,
Utah comes in, Kansas State. My favorite right now is Utah. Like, that's my overwhelming favorite. If they don't win the Big 12, I will be disappointed in that entire program. That
is true. Cam Rising is coming back.
Yeah, they should. That would be like putting Wisconsin in the 2010s AC, putting the prime Paul Chryst teams in the 2010s ACC and taking Clemson out of the picture. Like, they should kill everyone in the Big 12. But will they? I don't know. But yeah, I like Kansas, and that's the team that's up next. They return Jalen Daniels, and if he's healthy, he could be the best quarterback in the country. And they don't just return Jalen Daniels. People see the fact that Kotelnicki is gone, and they think that, losing him and other offensive pieces and a lot of the defense could pull Kansas way back. And absolutely. But they return parts of their offensive line. They return Jared Casey at tight end. They returned Devin Neal and Daniel Highshaw, who I think both ran for over 5 yards per carry. and they return every wide receiver that matters. Luke Grimm, Lawrence Arnold, Quentin Skinner, all of whom are good. So their offense with Jeff Grimes, who's had some success early at Baylor, definitely at BYU, and he loves to run a power spread that really focuses on running the football. I think that their offense is set. Defense has some concerns, but you were the one who brought up Kansas, although if you didn't, I would have put Kansas on here.
Yeah.
What do you think about Kansas in the Big 12? And how insane is it that 3 years ago this would be unthinkable, and now they could be talked about as like a college football playoff contender because of the conference they're in, and the winner of the Big 12 gets an auto berth to the playoff?
Yeah, I mean, 3 years ago, it would have been unthinkable to say that Kansas would win 5 games. Now we're talking about them making the college football playoff, and a big part of that is Jalen Daniels. He's electric, obviously dealt with some major injuries last year, decided to come back to Kansas, and I'm really happy he is because, you know what, this I'm going to go on a little bit of a nostalgic side tangent here quickly. Their fan base is awesome. And we've seen that throughout college basketball history, and it's fun for them to have a football team to root for because they pack that stadium when they've got a good squad. And they're going to have a good squad. And not only that, they're going to have an exciting team. Offensively, let's look at this squad. They averaged, this is last season, largely without Daniels. Their passing game averaged 10.1 yards per pass. I mean, that's good for number 2 in the country. That's without Jalen Daniels, folks. That's scary. Completion percentage was 62.9%, so that's all right. It's not horrible, not great. Passes per game, they didn't throw the ball very much, but with Daniels back, providing even more of that dual threat ability, and then hopefully them being able to throw the ball a little bit more frequently, still with some of that per pass effectiveness. Whew, man, they can put up a lot of points. They can put up I think they can just outscore people this year.
That's exactly what I was thinking. And yeah, that was not Jalen Daniels. That was Jason Bean, who was averaging 10 yards per pass attempt. That was their backup.
Unbelievable.
Who's just slinging it everywhere. His problem was just turnovers. That was his issue. But outside of that, he was a really, really good quarterback. And they lose Mason Fairchild at tight end, who was good, very reliable. But returning Daniels is huge. Travis Goff, their athletic director, gave Lance Leipold a massive contract extension. So, yeah, I'm a fan of Kansas this year. And I was last year when I predicted them to get 10 wins and fell 1 win short. 1 win. They went 9-4 and finished ranked. Yeah, I think there's more reasons to pick Kansas as a dark horse contender that'll actually follow through compared to Arizona. Up next, we have Missouri. This is another one that you brought to the table, your final and third one, which is funny because I didn't even plan on doing them all for you and then all for me. They just happened to be that way in alphabetical order. But Missouri, I think, is the closest to being just outside of dark horse, but being a legitimate contender. But there are reasons to view them in a doubtful light, which I think makes them somewhat of that dark horse contender. What do you like about Missouri, but what also concerns you about Missouri?
Oh, sorry, you froze for a second. Is it? Am I good to go?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Oh, sorry. A little bit of internet problems there on my end. Yeah, well, Missouri, and we've talked a lot about offenses today, and I hate to just keep talking about offenses, but Luther Burden is really, really good, folks. He is elite, and you return him. You also return Brady Cook, and Brady Cook, not that he was a star or anything last year, but he's got a year under his belt of playing meaningful SEC games in hostile environments like Athens, Georgia, where they almost did and maybe should have taken down So you've got experience at the quarterback position, which I think is going to address one of the biggest problems for them last year, which was third down conversion percentage. In comparison to their overall offensive output, they struggled in third down conversion percentage. So I think that might get a little bit better as Brady Cook gets another year under his belt. Luther Burden, of course, is a beast. Already talked about that. The problem comes on defense. And the problem comes with just you're not returning very much on defense. I'm searching right now, and we'll see if so Missouri returns 58% of their defensive production as opposed to 79% on the offensive end. So, you return some. It's not a complete collapse. It's not like Washington's offense level collapse, but there are going to be questions on the defensive end. But I think the offense overrides that.
Yeah, that is what I'm thinking with Luther Burden back. They bring in, I think Caden Green, offensive tackle from Oklahoma, who's really good. So they might upgrade their offensive line. And Cook was good last year. I don't think he was just average or above average. I'm pretty sure that he was good. He was much better than he was in 2022. But yeah, you're right. The defense loses almost everyone, including their defensive coordinator, Blake Baker, who goes to LSU. So we'll have to see. I do have, and I'm only saying this because I've done a live show about this with JT Sports, our guest, last week, and I did a whole video on this. I do have Missouri reaching the playoffs. I think that's kind of, given their schedule, I think that's an absolute no-brainer. Their schedule's easy. Out of, let's see, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, and LSU, and I think even Ole Miss. They only play one of those teams, and that's Alabama on the road. But the rest of their schedule is very, very doable. Yeah, I like that pick by you. I think that is a good pick, and I do think a lot of people look at the defensive players and the staff leaving, and they think, "Oh, back to reality for Missouri." I don't think so.
No.
Okay, so with my Darkhorse Contenders, I kind of want to flip the script and ask what you think about these teams first, and then I'll go in for the reasons why I've picked them. What do you think of Rutgers being a Darkhorse Contender?
They're going to have to develop. Rutgers is going to need a lot smoother of an offense this year. And what I mean by smooth, and that's if they want to contend for a possible college football playoff spot. I think they can win 6, even 7 games playing the type of ball they played last year. But last year it felt very much 3 yards in the cloud of dust, 2.5. We're going to grit our way through games, and we're going to survive until the fourth quarter. And they played a close game with Ohio State like that. Eventually, the Buckeyes pulled away. They played close with Michigan for a large part of the game before Michigan eventually pulled away. Able to throw the ball. Point. Rutgers is going to have a good passing offense this year, then I would be on board and say, yes, I think they can be a dark horse for the college football playoff.
Okay. So I agree with a lot of that, actually. Only thing I disagree with is, and this is an interesting point. I don't know if they can be just average at passing the ball. I think they check that box. I don't think they even need to be good. And the reasoning for that is they're top 10 in returning production, and their schedule is cupcake. Plus, remember 2021 Michigan? I know you do because you're a Michigan fan. What was our passing offense with Cade McNamara? It was just average, right?
Wasn't much.
Yeah, it was average, maybe above average. Wimsatt probably won't be as good of a passer as McNamara, or just as good, but he has legs. And Rutgers returns all of their offensive line. They bring back Kyle Monungai, who's a monster. And their defense, they could have the best linebacker room in the country, and their secondary is really good. And it's Greg Schiano. So the fact that he returns as punter and kicker means they'll have good special teams. I think that as long as they complete more than like 50 or 55% of their passes and their O-line and defense improves, that they'll fulfill my prediction of going 10-2. I mean, look at their schedule. It's Howard, Akron, at Virginia Tech, Washington, at Nebraska, Wisconsin, UCLA, at USC, Minnesota, at Maryland, Illinois, and they close on the road at Michigan State. USC might be the best team they play all year, and I don't think USC is a top 5 team or will even be top 10. Heck, I mean, you could say Wisconsin or even Virginia Tech could be the best team that they play all year. That's how weak their schedule is. I could see them go 11-1. Now, I didn't pick that because I think that's a little 10-2 is already bold. 11-1 is just insane. But yeah, I think that they're up here and should be up here because no one's talking about them. People think, oh, it's Rutgers. Well, they'll just go to a bowl game again. This team returns so much that I think that they can shock some people and they could punch people in the mouth who don't have an elite run defense. But that is just my opinion. This team...
You know...
Oh, you're good.
No, go ahead.
This team... Let's talk about Texas A&M. What do you think about A&M as a dark horse contender?
You know, I'm going to pull up some stuff on Texas A&M right now. I'm going to be honest, not extremely familiar with the Aggies this year. Allow me to pull up a couple databases. I guess. Ooh, man, Texas A&M. See, that's interesting. It really is. Give me 1 second here.
Oh, you're all good. The reason I picked them is because they're ridiculous level of talent and they have the number 2 portal class. That's why.
They do, yeah. You're right. I mean, the talent is there. That's without a shadow of a doubt. I guess the only doubt comes where it's like, okay, the talent has been there for years now and it hasn't produced anything. That would be my hesitation there. Could Texas A&M, could they make the college football playoff? Could they? Yes. I'm not sure I'd feel safe picking them. Although to be fair, I'm the guy who said Kansas, so I'm not sure I have much room to talk.
I think Kansas has a better chance than A&M, if I'm being honest.
Than A&M?
Yes.
Maybe simply even just based on schedule.
Yeah. A&M.
I'm pulling up the Aggies' schedule right now.
Yeah, I have it up right now. Let me read it off to you. They have Notre Dame. So they open up right out of the gate with a tough game at home. But if they can beat Notre Dame and Kyle Field, and I think they can, they then have McNeese State at Florida, Bowling Green versus Arkansas. They host Missouri. Then they get a bye, play at Mississippi State, host LSU, play at South Carolina, host New Mexico State, play at Auburn, and host Texas. All of their toughest games projected, of course you don't know, and Auburn could be good, but all of them are at home. And they return Moose Muhammad. Connor Weigman, many people I don't think know this, he was number 1 in quarterback efficiency rating before he got hurt. I mean, he was really good. And if he doesn't get injured, Jimbo Fisher, I would place money on this. If he doesn't get hurt, they probably beat Alabama. And Jimbo Fisher probably has a job. And he's just on the hot seat entering this year or under pressure. Rather than being out of a job and being paid that massive paycheck. I mean, Weigman was really good, and that's the reason Max Johnson transferred to UNC, is because the only reason Max Johnson started is because Weigman got dinged up. And they bring in Purdue's Nick Scorton at defensive end, who was really good. Shamar Turner returns at defensive tackle. And the place where they lose the most production is secondary. And their secondary was their weakness on defense. So that plus Mike Elko, who did very well at Duke and who was Texas A&M's best staff member when he was their DC, I think could be a recipe for success. But I'm not picking them to make the playoff. I think that they'll go 7-5, 8-4, maybe 9-3. I think it'll take a year or two to really contend.
Well, I mean, now, you know what? Looking at their schedule now, man, if they beat Notre Dame week 1, it's not.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. If they beat Notre Dame week 1, which isn't crazy, I don't think. I mean, the Irish lose quite a bit. That's at Kyle Field, like you said. If you beat Notre Dame week 1, you're looking at very, very possibly 9-3, even 10-2. And like you said, you got Missouri at home, you got Texas at home, you got LSU at home. Even Arkansas, you got Arkansas at home. Toughest road game is at Florida. Yeah, no, you know what? The more I look at it, the more I think this might, wow. If they can be, I think a lot rides on that Notre Dame game.
Yeah. I mean, a 10-2 team with this schedule, because they face enough teams who should be ranked, could probably get in, and not just an 11-1. Maybe if it's a down year where everyone has like tons of losses at the end, maybe 9-3. But there is no Georgia, there's no Ohio State on this schedule. I don't even think there's an Oregon on this schedule. I think all 3 of those teams that I just brought up, including Alabama, and I'd even, heck, we'll talk about this more later, even throw in Michigan. I just listed 5 teams who, in my opinion, are better than every team on that schedule.
Yep.
And Texas A&M with Le'Veon Moss, if they can develop that O-line, they'll be able to run the football. And Texas has questions at defensive tackle. So does LSU. Missouri has questions on defense. If A&M's defense can step up and Colin Klein and Wiegman can work together to create an awesome offense, this team could burn through that schedule with the talent that they have. It works. Finally, I have Virginia Tech. I think this is another one like Rutgers. What's your initial immediate thoughts when I mention Virginia Tech as a playoff contender? Not just a ACC, like reaching the championship game contender or being ranked, but like Virginia Tech being in the playoff.
Well, honestly, I like this. Would I pick them to make the playoffs? No.
Understandable.
But as a dark horse pick, the ACC is pretty weak. I've just pulled up their schedule right now. Their schedule is Vanderbilt, that I'll relatively confidently say you should win that game. Marshall, very winnable. Old Dominion, very winnable. Rutgers, we talked about how good that's a clash of a couple of dark horses potentially.
Yep.
Somebody's got to come out on top of that one. Rutgers very well could win that game, but is that unwinnable for Virginia Tech? No. Miami, again, you're in Miami, but how big of a home crowd advantage does Miami even have? You got Stanford, Boston College, Georgia Tech, Syracuse, Clemson, Duke, Virginia. That's your schedule. That's another thing where it's like, if you throw a Penn State on there, that's by far the best team on your schedule.
Yeah.
Or even a worse team than Penn State. So that's promising.
Yeah, I mean, you put LSU or Missouri on that schedule. That's the best team they play, because according FBS schedule uses ESPN's way too early top 25 as their top 25 until the AP poll comes out. Miami and Clemson are the only teams ranked in their schedule. I don't have Miami ranked. I have Clemson ranked, and I have Rutgers ranked. So FBS schedules, ESPN, and I only have Virginia Tech playing 2 ranked opponents. Only 2. And they're number 2 in returning production. They bring back Kyron Drones, who 17 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. He passed for over 2,000 yards. He also ran for 818, and he got better as the year went on. Malachi Thomas, Baisul Tutin, that's a good running back duo who should improve this year. And they have Daquan Felton, Ali Jennings. They have an underrated collection of skill players. And Brent Pry is a defensive mastermind. They had over double digits in forced fumbles, 40 sacks. They got good by the end of the season. I mean, watch what they did. I think it was against Tulane in their bowl game. They just dismantled Tulane like it was nothing. And they started out rough because Purdue beat them. It was not a good start, but they gained momentum and they ended the season with a winning record. I think that with this schedule, if the ball gets rolling, they have the O-line, they have the skill players, they have the defense, the potential on defense at least, and they have the head coach. I like Brent Pry. I loved him as a DC at Penn State, and even though Manny Diaz fielded an awesome defense last year, I think that Brent Pry was a better fit for Penn State defensively and a better DC in big games than Manny Diaz was. But both were elite defensive coordinators, and both are now coaching in the ACC as head coaches. Diaz is at Duke, and Brent Pry is at Virginia Tech. Yeah, I agree with you. Schedule is very, very easy. Well, we're finally past the Pac-12 to Big Ten pipeline, and our Darkhorse contender conversation is over. We've talked about a lot of teams today, and we're almost done here. But before that, we have to visit the Big Three. Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State. And I want to start out with Penn State. Is Penn State a national championship contender? Or is that asking too much for Franklin entering his first season of the 12-team playoff? Which he should make. If they don't make the 12-team playoff, I think that he should actually face hot seat talk. That would be ridiculous.
Yeah, I'm with you about the playoff. I do not see Penn State as a national championship contender. And it's just so – I hate to just go off blanket assumptions based on the past, but it's very hard for me to look at a team that has lost to Michigan year after year, has lost to Ohio State even longer, going back farther than that. Their last Big Ten championship was 2016. Correct? I believe it was 2016. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, it was.
And it's just tough. I mean, that's nearly 10 years ago now. And it's hard for me to look at that team and a team that, frankly, and allow me to go on a little bit of a rant here, seemed like they just horrendously misused Drew Aller, a guy with a ridiculous amount of arm talent. Did he look like the most poised guy in the world? No, obviously not. But guess what? That's on the coaching staff to get him right and to allow him to make throws that give him confidence. He looked like he was trapped in a box all season, had no options, had nowhere to go with the ball, was never allowed to uncork that big arm of his. And it was frustrating to watch him play in games and feel like this guy has so much talent, but he's allowed to use 5% of it because all he's allowed to do is throw 45-year-old Tom Brady checkdowns. So it's really hard for me to pick that team as a national championship contender. Should they make the playoffs? Yes. Will they contend for a championship? I highly doubt it.
This is an interesting point of disagreement because if not for Franklin and his just atrocious big game management, it would be this team or Georgia that would probably be my title pick. Like if let's say Ryan Day or Jim Harbaugh were coaching this team, I would pick them to win the Big Ten and potentially win it all. That's just because they've recruited well. I think they have an underrated strength and conditioning staff, and I love their assistants. To me, the problem is Franklin. Everything else can be managed, or the problems can be marginalized, and the strengths can be compounded or expanded. I mean, they have Kansas's offensive coordinator. They hired him, Kotelnicki. They returned both their guards and have recruited well on the offensive line for 3 or 4 years in a row. And for the first time in Franklin's career at Penn State, they had a first-team All-Big Ten offensive lineman. So there's a clear improvement on the O-line. And last year's O-line was one of the biggest by size and really good at short power running in football. They don't return all of it, and I think they'll take a little bit of a step back or stay the same. But there are things to like about Penn State. And with Kotelnicki there is the game changer for me. I mean, when I heard of that hiring, I thought to myself, okay, Franklin is finally going to step away from the offense, and even if he doesn't, I mean, this is the best OC hire that he made outside of maybe Joe Moorhead. And Joe Moorhead was the OC during that championship run that they had, and the guy who commanded the 2017 team that was number one in terms of game control and win probability, which is really game dominance. 2017, that was college football statistically most controlling and dominant team, was 2017 Penn State. So I think they're a national title contender, but I'm not picking them to win it. Aller didn't look good in the spring game. The O-line still has work, and that secondary does have questions. I'll have to see it in order to believe it to pick them to win it all, but I think they're a contender. I have them reaching the playoff. And if not for certain matchups, because the playoff seeding, of course, is different this time around, if not for the seeding that I'm projecting them to have, I could have them go as far as playing in the actual national championship, but just falling to Georgia or falling to a team who I think is better than them, especially in the trenches. But I can see why you think that way. Any final thoughts or rebuttal on that Penn State point?
Well, I mean, quite the opposite, actually. You pointing out that they do have Andy Kotelnicki as their offensive coordinator, that's very promising. We've already talked about the prowess that he showed at Kansas, and the offensive output that Kansas had, even without their starting quarterback. But man, it's still hard for me to fully buy into them as like, okay, this is a top 4 or 5 team in the country, until I with my own eyes see them beat Ohio State or Michigan, which they might. I mean, they might on paper. Obviously they don't play the Wolverines this year, but on paper, if those two teams met at a neutral field, Penn State probably is favored. But we'll see. Penn State's a team. I'll say this: I'd like to see Penn State be elite because it makes the Big Ten more fun.
I'd agree with that. And if they get their secondary right and they can have the same run defense they did last year, if Ohio State doesn't have an elite O-line, that's the if, and it based on the spring game, how they've developed and even recruited, but more so its development, strength, and conditioning, it doesn't look like Ohio State will have an elite O-line this year. The teams that have beaten Penn State on the ground last year, and to a certain degree the prior year, although the prior year a lot of teams could find some success on the ground against Penn State. Last year, Michigan was the only team that could run on Penn State, outside of Ole Miss, but that's because Penn State had no secondary in that game, so Ole Miss spread out that defense. If they can have the same defense they did last year with a better offense, hosting Ohio State, they should beat them. Like, if you put last year's Penn State team with a better OC, better play caller, because they're even with how bad Aller was last year, they had him throw 43 times. If they just ran the ball more, there's a chance that game could have gone to overtime, or even if balls bounced a different way, that they could have won, but it's unlikely. And Ohio State, we don't know if Ohio State will be better or worse than last year. It's the same thing with Penn State. So can they? Yeah, I agree with you. But will they? That's a question that we have yet to see. What about Michigan? Do you think Michigan is a national championship contender? They lose more than Penn State. But Michigan just won it all last year. So it's kind of an interesting question.
The only reason you would say Michigan, and by you I just mean people in general, the only reason that people would say Michigan is a national championship contender is because they won it last year with less. I'm going to say no. As my honest answer is no. I do not think Michigan is a national championship contender. Are they a playoff contender? 100% they are. Will they make the playoff? That has yet to be seen. there's a few holes that Michigan needs to fill. A couple major, I'll say question marks, because I think there's potential there, but we have yet to see. Number one is at quarterback. JJ McCarthy, at this point, is going to be legitimately probably will be a top 7 pick in the draft, maybe top 5 or even higher than that. So you're losing him. Alex Orji steps in. He's a big body type of guy, has not been asked to throw the ball much in his career. Doesn't necessarily, it might have to develop a little bit more of a passing game with him. In fact, will have to develop more of a passing game with him if Michigan wants to compete for a national championship or even for a playoff spot. So that's one question. The other question is, hey, you just lost the best running back in Michigan history, at least in my personal opinion. So that's no, when you lose the best quarterback and running back in your school's history, again, in my opinion, that's no easy task to replace. Donovan Edwards is good, but this Michigan squad is going to have to change the style with which how they run the ball. With Blake Corum, it was 3 yards in the cloud dust, 4 yards in the cloud dust. We're going to get up the middle, go downhill, and we're going to pound the rock at you and make you stop us. Donovan Edwards is not that same type of cannonball that Blake Corum is. He's a straight line guy, so it's going to be a lot more pitches maybe with Donovan Edwards, getting him outside the numbers, try to get him some space. So we'll see how the offense and the offensive play calling adjust to that. But there are a lot of questions for Michigan. The whole offensive line leads. I mean, you lose 6 people on the offensive line. You don't really have a clear tight end too. Khalil Mullings is your running back too, who I think is good, but we'll see how he fills in. So there's a lot of questions for Michigan.
I completely agree with the question marks. However, I'm taking the same route almost as Penn State. I think that they are I think that they are title contenders, and the reason for that is their D line and how much they've developed at O line, regardless of what they've lost. That's why. I mean, their D line should be the best in the country, with Graham coming back. Same with Grant, and then Derek Moore and Josiah Stewart. Will Johnson is probably going to be the nation's best corner. Nation's best defensive back, we'll see, because Caleb Downs could contend for that. And other players at Iowa, Georgia, Ohio State. We'll have to say, I mean, heck, maybe even Trey Amos, who transferred from Alabama to Ole Miss, with all the, maybe he could, or someone. We don't know. It's hard to do that with individual players, but Michigan has a good collection of individual players despite all they lost. They have questions at safety, at corner, but if they just get one transfer for each of those positions, they'll be deep there again. I'd say the O-line is a big question mark, but you can give them benefit of the doubt. Quarterback and receiver are probably the biggest areas of concern. I can't give Michigan benefit of the doubt at receiver. That's a what if where I'm just going to say no, can't do it. Frederick Moore and Samaj Morgan could be good. They could not. And at quarterback, I like Alex Orji, and I think he'd be above average or good this year. But without the same receiving core as last year, an offensive line, it's going to be, at best, the regular season level of play, and at worst, of course, inferior to that, and a defense that won't be as deep. You're playing on the road at Ohio State, you're hosting Texas, you're hosting Oregon, and Michigan's a team that last year, the only reason they won the playoffs is because they were so deep and so dominant that it didn't matter that they weren't built for the playoffs. They just killed you. They kind of won the playoffs in it's not a perfect analogy because Les Miles was just annoying at LSU. But you know that 2011 LSU team that, beat Bama 9-6? That team, inept offensive play calling. Michigan had much better offensive play calling than that team did. In fact, last year I think Michigan had really good offensive play calling. That LSU team would crush the skulls of their opponents, and there's nothing you could do to stop it. And then they ran into Bama in the BCS national championship and lost. I hope I'm not ranting too much, but the point that I'm trying to make is Michigan had one of their worst games of the season against Alabama in the Rose Bowl. And that's because that's what they do. Jim Harbaugh is not known for ever preparing in a bowl game, at least to play at the A+ level. And Michigan didn't, but they won because they were that good. And then they played better, at least in the second half and first quarter against Washington than you typically see in a bowl game. But they lose so much experience. They have so many questions, like you said. I think they can be a national title contender. But I think there are a few teams like Georgia, Ohio State, obviously those two, and I think even Alabama and Oregon who are better built to win it all and who I'd be more comfortable picking to win it all at this moment. But that D-line is going to be wicked. That's the country's best defensive line right now is Michigan's.
Oh, it's going to be unbelievable. The defense is going to be ridiculous. The questions really are on the offensive end. The defense is pretty much a lock to be elite, minus the linebacking core. The linebacking core, there are a couple of questions. You might need one more good linebacker in there. Of course, and I'm blanking on his name right now, a transfer from
Jayshon Barham.
Yes, Jayshon Barham. He is good. We'll see if he's as good as the guys Michigan trotted out there last year. But you do return a couple guys at the linebacker position. Allow me to pull up depth chart really quick. Yeah. So you do return Josiah Stewart, who played like edge / linebacker. Jayshon Barham, of course. Ernest Hausman also played big snaps last year. But, man, it's tough to replace Michael Barrett. It's hard to replace a 6-year guy. So you're going to be a little worse at linebacker, but defensive line and corner is going to be elite.
Yeah. And Rod Moore, unfortunately, got hurt at safety. I mean, I have to mention that, and Sainris's still leaving. That's why I want transfer secondary players, because if we suffer another injury, and I didn't mean to say we, but I'm a Michigan fan, and I think that way oftentimes. The secondary could be like Penn State's last year, where you have some elite players, but there are just enough holes where against an elite passing attack, or a Marvin Harrison Jr., or a Zachariah Branch, or an Emeka Egbuka, if healthy, or even a Tez Johnson at Oregon. I mean, you could get cooked. Or a Silas Bolden at Texas, and I don't want that. But yeah, it'll be awesome. I do agree with you too. I think the defense is close, if not already there, to be a lock to be elite. And finally, this is what you came to me with, along with the Pac-12, was Ryan Day. So I'm going to let you take the wheel here. Why do you want to talk about this? And how much pressure do you think he's on? And what are the expectations at Ohio State, not just this year, but like under Day moving forward?
All right. Well, I want to start by making a little bit of an analogy here. We all just watched March Madness. We're all sports fans here. A lot of us probably watched March Madness. In March Madness, you have to win 6 games. This many. Got to win 6 games at the end of the season. If you win it, and there's a certain group of teams where if you win it, that's great. If you don't, they're going to be a little bit disappointed, because that's just how good your team is. And you got to win 6 must-win games. And guess what? Most of the time, you don't win it, because it's tough to win 6 must-win games in a row. Ohio State has to do half of a March Madness. Ohio State's season, regardless of how you think the Michigan game is going to go, regardless of how you think the Oregon game is going to go, regardless of how you think any of these games are going to go throughout the season for Ohio State, I believe they play Penn State as well, their season is going to come down to 3 games at the end of the year. They are going to have to make half of a March Madness run and win a national championship. And if they don't, the season is going to be considered a failure, from many Ohio State fans' perspectives, if I'm reading the room correctly. And man, that's a lot of pressure. You know, I mean, it's hard to be under more pressure. It's almost like, and guys, Ohio State fans out there, the season starts in September, and I'm going to be tuning in. We're all going to be tuning in. But guess what? The season's going to start late in the year when it's cold out, and it'll be indoors, I'm sure, but late in the year, and you're going to have to win 3 games. And that's what it comes down to. So that's what makes this so intriguing for Ohio State, that they're going to have to win 3. When it's all said and done, they will have to win 3 games in a row and nothing less at the end of the year, and that will determine this team's legacy. And to me, it's fun because they're good enough to win it. So I don't know. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on kind of the, in my opinion, immense pressure that this team faces.
Yeah, I agree with that. And if they don't win the Big Ten championship game, it's 4 games.
Sure.
It'll be the first round, the rounds against the 4 highest ranked conference champions with byes, the semifinals, and then the title. I'm a obviously a Michigan fan. I do kind of find it intriguing, wondering like what happens this year if they lose to Michigan again, but like win it all. I would take losing to Ohio State in almost like a blowout, like what Michigan did to them in 2022, but Michigan wins it all instead. But I wonder if there's just so much frustration about that Michigan game that, I don't know. There's a lot changing this year with the 12-team playoffs. Some would argue that Michigan game doesn't matter anymore. Some would argue that game could matter more because now Michigan and Ohio State could play 2 or even 3 times. Like that rivalry could be even more intense if these 2 programs continue to play at an elite level. My frustration with all of this is the whole fire Ryan Day talk. And the fact that people actually think he's not a good coach. It's ridiculous. He's 56-8. He has won a playoff game, which Saban and Harbaugh were some of the other coaches who won playoff games. They're gone. Saban retired. Harbaugh's in the NFL. He's not coming back to college. He's just not. He's going to go to the NFL, and if he fails there, well, then he retires. You have Kirby Smart. You have Ryan Day, you have Dabo Swinney, and you have Kalen DeBoer. Those are the only teams, only coaches who have won playoff games. With those head coaches, only those 4. Correct me if I'm... Oh, no, Sonny Dykes, 5. But the 5-7 TCU was very forgettable. That was sad how they went from 99, only behind Georgia, to 0. I think he's an elite or near elite head coach who's just figuring things out. And I've said this before, I don't think any of Urban Meyer's teams, outside of maybe the 2014 team, would have beaten 2021, but especially 2022 and 2023 Michigan. I don't think they would have. I think those teams were, for 2022, just too explosive and too quick, and also too strong at O-line. And the 2023 team was too suffocating at defense while having a quarterback who was ridiculously efficient on 3rd down. Like, the offense wasn't the same, but it was annoyingly good when it needed to be. And the defense was generational. With an S&P Plus rankings, it was up there with 2021 Georgia's defense. Like, that's how good last year's Michigan defense was. So, do you think it's really national title or bust, like you say? And also, do you think that Ryan Day's on the hot seat, or do you think it's just competitive pressure?
If he loses to Michigan, if Michigan comes into Columbus this year and beats Ohio State, especially if Michigan has lost a game or even 2 at that point and is undefeated, then yes, Ryan Day is on the hot seat. Now it's a different question whether he would deserve to be on the hot seat. I'm not sure about that. If we're going to talk national championship or bust, it depends on what you mean by bust. I do have my concerns about what might happen to Ohio State's roster if they were to come up short, especially in a bad way, because they have partially bought that roster. And sometimes a bought roster doesn't have quite the loyalty that a recruited roster has.
That's a good
So
point.
that's something to keep an eye on, in my opinion. Obviously, I'll just say now, my 2 favorites to win the national championship are Georgia and Ohio State.
Yes.
Those are my favorites. Regardless of how much of a Michigan fan I am, Ohio State is unbelievably talented this year, and they should be, this, in my opinion, probably the second favorite. I'll give the slight edge to Georgia because Kirby Smart has done it multiple years. So let's get that out of the way. I'm not pretending that Ohio State sucks, but there is a lot of pressure And the scary thing, it's like almost a little bit like Michigan this year. You can't slip up once. If you slip up once, one game, even one quarter, one play against a good team, and suddenly, poof, I mean, there goes the $13 million and all the offseason hype. And that's what Michigan faced this year. And Michigan faced a 4th and 2 with the season on the line against Alabama. And fortunately for Michigan and for their fan base, for people like us, they converted that 4th and 2. And Ohio State's going to have moments like that. They're going to have to perform. Is it bust? It depends on what you mean by bust. I think they can lose in the Natty and Ryan Day keeps his job. He certainly should. But will the fan base be unhappy? Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think as long as he doesn't go 9-3 in the regular season, I think he's keeping his job entering next year.
Yeah.
It's just with the record he's had, if he goes 10-2 especially with the schedule they face, if they go 10-2, they'll make the playoff.
For sure.
I'd place an infinite amount of money on that. I wouldn't say that. There are some teams who I think could go 11-1 and even be snubbed from the playoff. I'm looking at you, Rutgers, and Iowa, even though I think 11-1 of those teams probably would make it, but they could be snubbed. Their schedules are easy. Ohio State's I think it's actually one of the toughest schedules in the Big Ten. And that's without them facing themselves, who I think are the best team in the Big Ten. They play Oregon and Penn State on the road, and they host Michigan, and they don't play a Notre Dame or an Oregon or a Oklahoma or a tough non-conference team like Ohio State typically does, to their credit. But it's a tough schedule. And while I do think it's more competitive pressure than hot seat for Ryan Day, I know that the fan base is rabid to defeat Michigan. I know that their players are. That's why they're returning. It's not just to win it all. It's to beat Michigan and win the Big Ten. Because when you look at C.J. Stroud and Marvin Harrison Jr. leaving Columbus without a single win against Michigan, you think, what have we done? Like, what did we waste? The best quarterback in Ohio State history didn't beat Michigan once. And some could say it was due to, cheating, and I'll listen to that in part. But those are 15 and 22-point losses, and in the 22 games specifically, Stroud didn't play so well. I mean, he had one of his least efficient games of the year. So they have to be more efficient. They have to be more physical. They can't be like what they were last year. Last year, do you remember when Ryan Day opted to kick that field goal against Michigan on 4th and 2 instead of go for it? Like, everyone thought he would go for it.
Yes.
He kicked the field goal. In retrospect, I think I mentioned in my reaction to that game that actually wasn't a bad decision, because his team was so inconsistent that there was no way you could rely on that offense to convert a 4th down and 2 against that defense. That would have been a huge, not necessarily a huge risk, but that could have, I don't know. I don't think there was much of a difference between that play, going for it, and attempting for the field goal. I think both of them were equally unlikely to produce anything in retrospect. So he just opted, okay, kick the field goal. Our kicker has range and is typically accurate anyway. I mean, they played a better. They cannot. They have to use their talent efficiently. They've been the most talented Big Ten team forever. Like, even in the 90s, when they had John Cooper, they were more talented than Lloyd Carr's Michigan by recruiting rankings. They've had the most talent forever. In 21 and 22, they probably had the highest ceiling, but Michigan was just more consistent and better coached and tougher. Last year, Michigan was more consistent and tougher, and they had the higher ceiling. They aced Ohio State in every possible way, which is why, despite not having their head coach in Ohio State, I think, playing a pretty good game, given what they had, they still lost. That can't happen again this year. If that happens for a 4th year in a row, it's like what you said. Even if he keeps his job, and even, let's say he's not on the hot seat, maybe because they make a run, or that's just not what Ohio State is, despite the fact that we think that way, or they lose to Michigan, but they win it all, there will be a segment if not the entire fan base, that's still mad about that because the game matters that much. And it will hamper them in national title hopes too, because if they lose to Michigan, depending on what happens, they could miss Indy, or they enter Indy with an L, or let's say they miss Indy entirely. Now you have to go through 4 games to win it all, which requires even more depth and toughness. Yeah, I agree with you.
I'm looking forward to it, man. I mean, that specific part of the college football season, watching this Ohio State team, because they are so talented. It is insane how talented they are. I mean, just you can read all up and down this roster. Emeka Ibuka, a first-round talent coming back. I mean, are you kidding me? Caleb Downs transferring in from Bama. You can go. I mean, I'm looking at a whole list of names right now. I don't just want to read names, but there's a couple just to start you off. They're so talented, so they're going to be fun to watch. And hey, what do we love in sports? We love competition. We love talent. They've got that, and we love big stakes and bright lights. And there's certainly going to be plenty of big stakes and bright lights on Ohio State this year.
That's true. I completely agree with that. Luckily for Ohio State fans, I do think they're going to go undefeated in the regular season. It's just a question of who you play in Indy and how far you go in the national title. But only concern I'd have for Ohio State is maybe quarterback, though they looked good in the spring game. For me, it's mostly trench play and strength and conditioning. Don't suffer injuries. Don't let your O-line look the way it did last year, where you had guys falling over each other, blocking each other. You couldn't open up a hole to save your life unless you had Travion Henderson. Just, that can't happen again. Otherwise, you will lose to an Oregon or a Michigan or to a Penn State, or maybe 2 of them. And you certainly won't be beating Georgia if you have that O-line. Unless Georgia somehow has their worst team under Smart since 2020, and I don't think that's happening.
No. Georgia, there could be a whole separate video on Georgia. Georgia's scary.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, thank you for talking about Ryan Day and Ohio State. Really, the Big Ten as a whole. I mean, we touched on whether it was Rutgers or briefly in the super chat at the beginning of the video on Nebraska and Michigan State, USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, the former Pac-12 schools, and also bringing some of your ideas and content to the table with the Darkhorse teams, and again, Ohio State, and how you think the former Pac-12 schools will transition. Thank you for coming on the show, Zachary. I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. Thanks. It's fun. Hey, you get to sit here and rather than do schoolwork, talk about college football for an hour and a half. Not too bad. It's not. There are worse ways to spend a night.
Exactly. I have to do homework after this video. Someone just did send a super chat, and by the way, anyone, whether it's super chat or not, ask a few questions, and we'll answer just a couple of them before we get out of here. Jake Kivett asks with a $5 super chat. Thank you, Jake, for the $5, by the way. Which Big Ten West team, like former Big Ten West team, is the best shot to make the playoffs in the coming few years? His best guess is Nebraska or Iowa, which I actually kind of agree with. What are your thoughts?
If I'm going with what I really think and not a dark horse, I'm probably going to go Iowa, because Iowa's been around that 12 range before. We've seen them be near that range before, but of course the playoff was 4 teams, so they really weren't even a consideration. But this year, yeah, with the extension, give them a couple years, maybe. Even, who knows, maybe this year. But certainly within a couple of years, if you can develop some sort of an offense, you're going to need to score points. But if you can develop some sort of an offense, then, yeah, I can see Iowa.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, they hired Tim Lester to replace Brian Ferentz. I think anyone over Brian Ferentz would be a massive upgrade, so why not? I do want to mention, though, like Wisconsin. I think people have sold Wisconsin due to the fact that they disappointed in year 1. If Fickle could build a playoff contender at Cincinnati with an expanded playoff and expanded talent pool, I see no reason why Wisconsin, they should make it within the next probably 3 or 2 years.
Yep.
They should make it. Absolutely. I mean, their schedule this year is insanely tough with Alabama in the non-con, and then Oregon, USC, Penn State, and USC's on the road, Iowa's on the road. So they do have a tough schedule, but 2025, 2026, they should make it. Let me see if we have any other questions. If not, we'll get on out of here. Jake says he's not as confident in Wisconsin as others seem to be. Well, Jake, that's understandable. I mean, I thought they would win the West easily last year because they had some of the talent in place, but they didn't, whether it was injuries or the fact that Tanner Mordecai just looked horrific in Big Ten play, despite the fact that they had a good receiver core. I don't know exactly what happened, so we'll just have to see what Luke Fickell and Wisconsin, what they produce. We'll just have to see on that.
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, look at Wisconsin's class coming in. I mean, 25th in the country, top 25 class, 23 composite rank. You got the 21st ranked transfer class in the country. So, I mean, a little more than a respectable class. 2020. Excuse me. Sorry. Yeah. So 2024 class, 2025 class, 19th in the country. Luke Fickell, he's doing his thing. Like you said, if he can build it at Cincinnati, he can build it at Wisconsin. Wasn't it a disappointment year one? Yeah. But it's hard to believe Luke Fickell just forgot how to coach overnight.
Yep. You took the words right out of my mouth. Okay, 2 more things. One's not a question, but it's a fun comment by not just a patron, but a loyal watcher. Now there's a question. It's by Armand Hammer. I think it's in reference to me talking about Nebraska. Didn't you say that 3 years ago? This is in reference to my 2022 prediction where I thought they'd win the West, go 10-2, and just kind of own everyone in the West except for Iowa and maybe Wisconsin. And I was totally wrong. They fired Frost by week 3. Week 2, actually, because they played in week 0. I think I said they could have been a playoff contender that year, but I don't think I really ever viewed them that way because they would have had to go through an East team and they played Michigan, and no team with 2 losses would get in. So I think I viewed Nebraska just as a New Year's Six Bowl contender that year, which was still way off, but I don't think I ever thought they could win the Big Ten given Michigan was on their schedule and they'd have to play Michigan again in Indy or Ohio State, who I thought were both infinitely better than that Nebraska team. But, yeah. And SFS Inverted, he's an Ohio State fan. He said, "Hey, Sam, remember my words. We are going to run the ball down your throat." With Judkins and Henderson, and if the O-line improves and the guard play, to its credit, looked better in the spring game, you also have to remember that Will Howard is mobile, so that helps. I could see that happening. I don't think it will, but I didn't think it would last year either in the preseason, and I thought Ohio State would have a monster run game last year because they returned their guards and their entire running back room. I thought last year they were sort of going to be a mini Michigan on offense with a much better receiver core and as a result, higher ceiling passing game. That didn't happen. Their rushing attack was pretty bad by their standards until November, and even then it had limited consistency. But this season this Ohio State rushing attack should be what I thought they were going to have last year, where it will be one of the better rushing attacks in the country. And it's even with an O-line with question marks, just due to the fact of they have Henderson and Judkins. But we'll see if Ohio State can run it down Michigan's throat, because Michigan has 3 really good, and 2 of them are elite players at defensive tackle, and they have great near elite defensive ends, and we still have linebackers and secondary players too. So I think the game this year will be more defensive than it ever has been in the previous 3 seasons. Heck, you could go back. It'll be the most defensive edition of the game since 2017, when Michigan had O'Korn and we were still in the game until the fourth quarter. It'll be that type of game where it's just disgusting, but it will be fun to watch because it's the game. What do you think about Ohio State's rushing attack versus Michigan's run defense?
Well, I mean, first of all, Ohio State has ballers at running back. I mean, let's not. Trayvon Henderson coming back. You got Judkins, Quinton Judkins.
Quinshawn.
Am I butchering? Yeah. You got him coming in, and man, I mean, he's an 1,100-yard rusher over at Ole Miss in a really good offense at Ole Miss. Obviously, Trayvon Henderson, we know what he can do when he's healthy. Man, I mean, going up against Mason Graham is not easy, dude. Going up against Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant is not easy on the inside. I mean, that's going to be a war. And, Ohio State's going to try to run the ball. And you know what? I think they will run the ball some, especially if they get creative and go around the edges of that Michigan defense. Michigan lost 2 big edges this year in Braden McGregor and Jalen Harrell. So that could be a potential point of weakness for this squad. So if Ohio State attacks the edges, I think they might actually have some success running the ball against the Wolverines. The problem might come running the ball inside against 2 potential All-Americans, 1 likely top 10 pick, and another potential first-round pick.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. Okay, everyone. Thank you again, Zach, for coming on, and thanks to all of you for whether it's your super chats or your questions at the end. I appreciate it. We'll see you next week, which is when, by the way, Corn Crazed is coming on. For all of you Nebraska fans and also big fans of his channel, he has about 20,000 subs. He's coming on to talk about Nebraska football, a little bit about Nebraska's spring game, and really, I think do what Zach did today, and maybe a little bit of what JT did, like a blend of the two. I don't know exactly what we're going to talk about yet. I tend to ask my guests what they want to talk about and then provide topics that I think sort of complement that. JT Sports wanted to talk about USC and Nebraska, which I think complemented not just this video, because we talked about USC again, and even a little bit about Nebraska, but we also talked about playoff contenders and teams with really high ceilings and low floors last episode, and Nebraska and USC fit that bill. But here we are, and thank you again for coming on, and I'll see you next week, Thursday, again at 7, I think 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, though, because Connor is all the way out in Los Angeles, it might be a little later, but I'll double check in with him, and I'll let you guys know either a day or several hours in advance of the stream, but it'll be at 7 p.m., if not maybe an hour later than that. Thank you guys for being on, and thank you, Zach, for providing your excellent analysis and commentary. We'll see you all soon.